Children from German occupants and Soviet women could be born as a result of voluntary romances with German soldiers, for example, for a piece of bread, as well as a result of abuse by the Nazis. The German fascist fiends committed a wild and heinous crime in the village of Trosna, Kursk region. The Hitlerites drove young girls from the surrounding villages to this village to send them to hard labor in Germany. Here all the girls were locked in a barn. At night, a German military unit passed through the village. Fascist scoundrels broke into the barn and abused the Soviet girls in it. It was not customary to talk about the fact that during the German occupation, Soviet women had children from the Germans. And most of all, the unfortunate women themselves, who were called collaborators, were ashamed of it. They were so ashamed that after the return of the Red Army, many of them forged documents for their children or ran away with them to other villages, fearing denunciation from their neighbors. Contacts with Russian women sometimes ended very badly for the Germans. And the point here is not only venereal diseases or the fact that the girl could turn out to be a partisan, thanks to whose data this German could be shot the next day by her friends. The point is that sexual intercourse of an Aryan with Untermenschen was considered by the Nazis as a racial disgrace and spoilage of German blood, and therefore forbidden. According to the German historian Regina Mühlhäuser, only in 1944, Wehrmacht field courts convicted 5,149 German soldiers for prohibited relations with Russian women. Of course, in reality, there were many more such offenses. For the most part, officers looked at them through their fingers, and the prohibitions and regulations coming from Berlin were simply ignored. For example, in occupied Novgorod, every morning Germans who had returned from local women were running through the city to the barracks. This problem worried Hitler very much. He tried to limit the relations of German soldiers with Soviet women by a special directive. For, as we know, he considered the Slavs racially inferior. However, fascist commanders in the field showed some independence. For example, the German commandant of Orel Adolf Gehman even issued a decree on alimony for Soviet women who gave birth to Wehrmacht soldiers. Women agreed to have relations with the invaders for many reasons. Some were really hungry and wanted to feed their children or find a protector from constant harassment. Some were attracted by the beautiful life with German officers. Some really fell in love. But more often than not, of course, it was about deals. In some cases, it took unexpected forms. For example, the Spaniards from the Blue Division, being near Novgorod, robbed Russian villages neighboring their location to bring their girlfriends cows and pigs as a gift. Eventually, sexual collaborationism reached such a scale that the occupation administration had to deal with the consequences somehow. Since March 1943, in a number of places, the Germans began to pay monetary compensation to Russian mothers who gave birth to Germans. The few brothels on the home front could not meet the needs of the Wehrmacht. In addition to the fact that they were few, the Germans could not recruit staff. Russians did not go to them, except for those who had been engaged in prostitution before the war. But even these were few. Because of this, many crimes occurred in the captured territories. In the village of Pereshek, Leningrad region, the German occupiers organized a savage pogrom. They took from the population all the bread, cattle, chickens, all the clothes and household utensils. After the looting, the Germans abused several girls and then burned the entire village. The population of the USSR had an extremely negative attitude towards the opening of brothels. For example, in Smolensk, in a brothel for flight officers, worked only prostitutes from France and Poland who were brought to Russia especially for this purpose. The brothel in Pskov recruited local women, some of them forcibly, some of them were recruited from among those who were desperate to earn their bread. This was also the case in other occupied cities. Another category of women who entered into relations with the Germans voluntarily were underground fighters. Girls endured humiliation and insults in order to help the partisans. In some cases, it ended tragically. According to the memories of the scout, Zoya Voskresenskaya, One such underground girl named Olga was left as a resident in Orel. But she was forgotten. Her reports with hard-won information were not read by anyone, and after the liberation of Orel, she was sentenced to 25 years for collaboration with the Hitler occupiers, that is, for dancing and drinking with the Germans. Only after several years, Olga managed to get the case reconsidered, released, rehabilitated, and her honest name returned. Most of the children born to Germans were given to orphanages. There were times when people treated these women and their children with understanding, and they lived like ordinary Soviet families. Neighbors knew that often women were forced to make contact with the enemy, and it is foolish to blame them. As stated earlier, often such children were born as a result of Wehrmacht soldiers committing serious crimes. There continue to be reports of heinous atrocities by fascist bandits. In the village of Vasilievka, Orel region, drunken German soldiers forced girls raped and beaten by them to dance. How many German children were born in occupation in the USSR? Nobody counted. In Norway, during 5 years of occupation, about 5,000 people were born of Germans. In France, about 200,000. Taking into account that in occupation in the USSR, there were more than 70 million people, and more than 5 million invaders passed through the Eastern Front. We will not make a mistake if we assume that we are talking about at least a few tens of thousands. In the post-war Soviet Union, this aspect of the war was taboo. Interestingly, despite isolated cases of criminal prosecution, women found to have links with the Nazis were not persecuted in the Soviet Union. Someone could leave to another city because of the threat of arrest, someone forged the date of birth of a child in the documents, but there was no question of shaving the head or standing in the square with a sign, "I slept with German soldiers," as it was done in France or Holland. It is interesting that in the same Norway, the fate of such women was sadder. After the liberation of this country, 5,000 women who gave birth to children by Germans were sentenced to 1.5 years of forced labor, and their children were distributed among orphanages. A photograph from the last year of the war shows Dutch girls arrested for association with the occupiers, casually smoking and smiling. It is unlikely they have any idea that very soon they will be subjected to a public